deep
Okay.
into the heart of the Mongol Empire. You know, the one that went like from the steppes all the way to the edges of China. We're going way beyond just like the usual like dates and names.
Right.
I think you're here because you really want to understand the Mongol strategies and those power moves that helped them build this massive empire and how it worked.
Right.
Or really like how it fell apart.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating about the Mongol Empire is that it really presents this puzzle, this incredible military success, but then relatively quickly it fragments.
Right.
So we're going to unpack why that is.
I've always been so struck by how the Mongols, like, they could conquer so effectively, but then it seemed like they really struggled with the whole, like, ruling for the long haul thing.
Yeah.
It's like they were amazing sprinters, but not really marathon runners.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. One key factor that historians often point to is acculturation, or the lack of it. The Mongols, even after like a century in places like Persia, often stayed very separate from the societies that they governed.
Oh, wow.
They held on to their customs, their language, and that nomadic warrior lifestyle.
So they're almost like, instead of becoming part of the fabric of these societies, they were almost like a separate layer on top, always the other.
Exactly.
Wouldn't that make it harder to actually govern effectively, though?
Absolutely. It creates this distance between the rulers and the ruled. And this is where we start to see some of those cracks in the foundation of this empire. Take the Ilkhanate in Persia, for example. It's like a mini version of the entire empire's challenges. When the last Ilkhan, Abu Sa'id, died in 1335 without a direct heir, it triggered this whole chain of events.
So classic, like, power vacuum scenario. Right. Things got messy fast.
Oh, you bet.
Okay.
And this is where the Mongol strategies for choosing leaders get really interesting.
Okay.
Because, you see, even though there were other Chinggisid candidates, relatives of Genghis Khan, they essentially become pawns in this power game that's being played by these ambitious Mongol chiefs.
So bloodline, which was usually like such a big deal, started to matter less than who had the muscle to grab the throne.
Right.
Is that a sign that, like, the Mongols were maybe losing sight of what had made them so successful in the first place?
Possible, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe that fierce individualism that made them such great warriors wasn't actually so good for building these lasting dynasties.
Right. It's like their strength became their weakness over time.
Right.
And we also have to, like, look at things from the Persian perspective, too. Because historians at that time often blamed the downfall of rulers on, like, their own personal failings. Like neglecting advice or indulging in too many pleasures. I mean, that's easy to do, right? It's just blame the leader. But I'm guessing the reality was a lot more complicated than that.
You're right. But it shows you how important the perception of a ruler was.
Oh, okay.
Even if the problems ran deeper, if a Khan was seen as weak or out of touch, it could totally undermine their authority.
Okay.
So it's a power move, but a very different kind.
Before we get into the whole empire collapsing, I've heard this story about, like, a Sufi mystic going to the Mongol court.
Right.
And I've always been kind of curious about that.
Oh, you're thinking of Chelebi Arif.
Okay.
A descendant of Rumi.
Okay.
That anecdote's a great example of how, even though they had all this military power, they could be really sensitive to spiritual authority.
It sounds almost unbelievable.
Yeah.
This mystic supposedly goes to the Mongol court, pleads the case of some dervishes, is basically ignored, and then his anger somehow contributes to the Mongols' decline.
Right.
It's like, how could that be?
It might sound far-fetched to us now,
Yeah.
but it shows how much power was tied to these religious figures back then.
Oh.
Even the Mongols, who weren't exactly known for their piety, couldn't just ignore that.
Right.
It's a reminder that there's more than one way to wield power.
Right. Not just about conquering land, but like conquering hearts and minds.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Right.
But, you know, there's also another side to this story, right? Didn't that satirical poet, Ubaidi Zakani,
Oh, yeah.
have something to say about all of this?
Absolutely.
Always had, like, a really sharp wit.
Yeah, he basically mocked this idea that neglecting these religious figures led to the Mongol decline.
Okay.
He was being sarcastic, of course.
Of course.
But he suggested that, really, their early success came from Hulagu Khan purging all these intellectuals and religious leaders after he took Baghdad.
So he's kind of saying that being too tolerant was the problem.
He was definitely poking fun at the hypocrisy of some Mongol leaders who tried to present themselves as these pious rulers while still using these really brutal tactics.
It's funny because it really reveals this tension between the Mongol way of doing things, which was very much like conquer first, ask questions later, and the expectations of the societies that they were ruling.
Exactly. And you have to remember that Persian historians were looking at Mongol success through this lens of Islamic principles. So in their eyes, a ruler who neglected religious duties was basically doomed to fail.
It reminds us that history is always being like filtered through somebody's perspective.
Absolutely. Not neutral.
But this whole issue of like acculturation or the lack of it seems really key to understanding why the Mongols, for all of their might, couldn't create a lasting empire. So like, why were they so resistant to blending in with the people they conquered?
That's a question historians are still debating. One theory is that the Mongols really saw themselves as conquerors, first and foremost. And they might have believed that fully adopting local customs would somehow like weaken their warrior identity.
So it's almost like they were afraid of being absorbed by the very cultures they were trying to rule.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
And maybe that fear was their undoing.
We've talked a lot about the things the Mongols did wrong. But, I mean, they clearly also did a lot of things right. I mean, you're talking about this massive empire built in like an incredibly short amount of time. What were some of those key strategies and power moves?
They were masters of several key strategies. First, their military tactics were just devastatingly effective.
Like what?
Expert horsemanship, archery. They were so lightning fast, incredibly accurate, which gave them a huge advantage in open battle. I mean, can you imagine these Mongol horsemen thundering across the steppes, raining arrows down on their enemies?
Talk about a psychological advantage.
Absolutely. They were masters of psychological warfare. They would often deliberately spread rumors about their own brutality, which led many cities to just surrender without a fight.
So really smart, but also like pretty ruthless. But I've also read that they weren't afraid to like adapt and learn from their enemies.
That's right.
Too. Like with siege warfare. They weren't traditionally like siege experts, but they learned from the best.
Exactly. They incorporated Chinese engineers and techniques to build these really powerful siege weapons that allowed them to conquer all these fortified cities.
So they were willing to like borrow the best ideas.
Absolutely.
No matter where they came from.
They were very pragmatic, always looking for an edge.
And we can't forget about their logistics, right?
Yeah, the Mongols established this incredibly efficient system of relay stations and supply lines.
Which was essential for maintaining such a vast empire.
Oh, absolutely. It allowed them to move their armies these vast distances and keep them supplied even in totally unfamiliar territory.
So it wasn't just about, like, brute force. They were incredibly organized and strategic.
Yeah, it's like they were playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it.
And they were masters of intelligence gathering. They invested heavily in building these networks of spies and informants, which gave them all this valuable information about their enemy's weaknesses.
They knew the terrain, they knew their enemy, and they weren't afraid to exploit those weaknesses.
Exactly. And they were also masters of, you know, exploiting any divisions that already existed. They'd often pit different factions against each other to weaken the resistance and make it easier to take control.
Classic divide and conquer.
Classic divide and conquer.
It sounds like the same Mongol strategies that brought them so much success. You know, being adaptable, strategic, using psychological warfare might have actually become weaknesses later on.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
As the Mongols got more entrenched in power, they might have become less adaptable.
Right.
More reliant on those early methods that had brought them so much victory.
It's easy to get stuck in your ways when you've been winning for so long.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And remember, we're not talking about some small kingdom here.
Right.
This empire was vast. And diverse.
Yeah.
And governing it effectively required a lot more than just military power.
Right.
They needed to understand all these different cultures and political systems.
And as we've been talking about, that's where the cracks start to show.
Exactly.
So, like, to understand how it played out, we really need to look at what happened after the Ilkhanate fragmented.
Okay.
We've got this fractured political landscape, all these different groups, they're all vying for power.
Exactly. Abu Sa'id's death in 1335, that was a real turning point.
Okay.
Suddenly, all these elements that the Ilkhanate had been holding together, they were unleashed, each fighting for dominance.
Wow.
You have the Chupanids, who were based in northwestern Iran.
Okay.
They were known for being super aggressive, really ruthless.
So like, kind of like the old guard?
Yeah, the embodiment of traditional Mongol methods.
Okay.
They really put their faith in military might above all else.
Okay, got it.
But then you have the Jalayirids.
Okay.
Who were ruling in Baghdad and then later in Tabriz. And they took a different approach.
Okay.
They were much more moderate, more interested in engaging with Persian culture and arts.
So almost like a, if you can't beat them, join them kind of approach.
And it seemed to work for them, at least for a while. I mean, they managed to hold on to a big chunk of territory for several generations.
Wow.
They understood that to rule effectively, they needed to adapt to the cultural and political realities on the ground.
But wouldn't, like, their embrace of Persian culture have alienated some of those Mongol hardliners?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it created this real tension within the Mongol elite. And it kind of highlights that question of identity that we talked about earlier.
Right.
How much to hold on to tradition versus how much to adapt.
Right.
The Jalayirids' approach, though, it definitely represented a shift in thinking away from that traditional Mongol model.
So we've got these two competing Mongol factions, each trying to kind of navigate this new landscape.
Right.
But what about those non-Mongol dynasties that popped up?
Right.
Like the Ingids and the Muzaffarids.
You're right. They emerged in southern Iran,
right,
an area that hadn't really been directly under Mongol rule. And their rise to power shows just how much Mongol rule had reshaped the political scene, even in places beyond their direct control.
So it's almost like the Mongols created this power vacuum.
Exactly.
And all these different groups are rushing in to fill it.
Yeah, and it really just highlights how complex this period was.
Yeah.
With all these different forces at play.
Yeah, and then you have the Sarpedars in Khorasan.
Right.
I mean, their story's always been so fascinating to me. This group of landowners who teamed up with Sufi dervishes to resist Mongol rule.
Talk about an unlikely alliance.
Right.
It shows just how widespread that resentment of Mongol rule was.
Yeah.
They were able to tap into this popular discontent with the oppressive taxation, and they managed to carve out their own territory for a while.
Wow. So it wasn't just infighting among the Mongols.
Right.
There was this undercurrent of resistance bubbling up from below.
Yeah, and it shows that even when you're facing overwhelming military might, that will to resist, fueled by religious fervor and social discontent, can be a really powerful force.
So the Mongols might have been masters of conquering, but their power moves weren't always enough to keep people subjugated.
It's a good reminder that empires can be really vulnerable from both within and without.
Speaking of which, let's shift our focus eastward to China.
Okay.
Where the Yuan dynasty was facing its own set of challenges. We talked earlier about this theme of acculturation.
Right.
Or the lack of it, kind of playing out across the empire.
Right.
But in China, things were even more complex.
Absolutely.
I mean, you're talking about one of the oldest and most sophisticated civilizations in the world.
And don't forget, the Mongols were drastically outnumbered in China.
Oh, wow.
They couldn't just impose their will through brute force like they could in other places. They really had to find a way to rule this vast population without, you know, triggering this full-scale rebellion.
So how did they even approach that?
Yeah.
Like, what were some of their strategies?
Well, one of the key challenges for them was navigating the Confucian system.
Okay.
Especially the civil service exam.
Right. Those exams were like the ultimate power move.
Exactly.
In Chinese society. Pass those and you're set for life.
Exactly. And at first, the Mongols got rid of the exams.
Oh, yeah.
Which, as you can imagine, did not go over well with the Chinese elite.
That's a pretty bold move, even for the Mongols.
It was like they were trying to dismantle the entire system of governance that had kept China stable for centuries.
That's incredible.
But they learned pretty quickly that they needed to find some kind of compromise if they wanted to maintain stability.
Right.
So they eventually brought the exams back. But they made some strategic tweaks.
Oh, okay. Like what?
They created quotas for Mongol and other non-Chinese candidates, which gave them a lot more control over who was entering the bureaucracy.
So it was like trying to strike that balance between appeasing the Chinese elite and also holding on to power.
Precisely. And this tension between accommodation and control really defined much of the Yuan dynasty's rule.
It's almost like they were constantly walking a tightrope, trying to maintain their Mongol identity, but also adapting to the realities of governing China.
Right.
But just like in Persia, they couldn't escape those internal power struggles.
No, unfortunately not.
Yeah.
Factionalism and infighting plagued the Yuan court. It weakened the central authority, and it created these opportunities for ambitious individuals to really exploit the system.
So no matter how vast their empire,
the
Mongols just couldn't escape their own internal divisions.
It's a familiar story.
It is.
And it reminds us that even the most powerful empires are ultimately made up of people, people with their own ambitions, rivalries, competing visions.
Okay, so we've talked about those internal factors that contributed to the decline. The power struggles, the cultural clashes, the failure to adapt. But we also can't forget about external pressures, right?
Of course not.
They had to play a role as well.
Absolutely. In both Persia and China, the Mongols were facing growing resistance from the people that they ruled.
Makes sense.
We talked about the Sarbadars in Persia, but there were other uprisings too. People were just tired of the oppressive taxation, cultural differences, being ruled by outsiders.
And in China, that resistance eventually led to the Yuan dynasty being overthrown.
That's right.
By the Ming dynasty, founded by Zhu Yuanzhang.
Right. Zhu Yuanzhang was a Han Chinese rebel leader who rose to power during all that chaos.
And instability of the late Yuan period.
Right.
He was able to unite all these different resistance groups, rally popular support, and ultimately drive the Mongols back to the steppes.
So despite their military prowess and initial success, the Mongols were ultimately unable to hold on to power.
That's right. Their decline is a cautionary tale. For any aspiring empire builder. Conquering through military might is one thing. But ruling effectively over the long haul, that requires a different set of skills altogether.
It's like they mastered the art of the initial power move, the swift takeover. But they really struggled with the long game, subtle art of governing these diverse populations and adapting to these changing circumstances.
And that brings us back to acculturation, doesn't it? If the Mongols had been more willing or even able to integrate with the societies that they conquered. Build more inclusive and stable political systems.
Could they have created a more lasting legacy?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
It's almost like they were so focused on holding on to their Mongol identity, on maintaining that warrior spirit, that they missed the opportunity to build something that was truly enduring.
It's a fascinating paradox. Their strength, in a way, became their weakness.
So we're back, and as we've been talking about the Mongol Empire and all its complexities, I keep thinking about how their story, it's not just ancient history, it's like a reminder that even the most powerful empires face this like fundamental challenge, which is how do you hold on to power once you've conquered?
It's the timeless question, right?
Right.
And the Mongols, even though they had, you know, all this military genius, they get us a really powerful example of what not to do. They conquered all this territory, but they couldn't bridge those cultural divides, and it ultimately caught up with them.
It's like they were playing a game of Risk, but but on this massive scale,
right.
conquering territory after territory.
Mm-hmm.
But then they had to switch gears and figure out like how to actually govern all these different people and cultures.
And that shift from conqueror to governor, that seems to have been what really tripped them up.
Okay.
Their strategies, which were so brilliant in war, they didn't translate very well to the messy realities of actually ruling these diverse populations.
It's a reminder that, like, sustainable power, whether we're talking about empires or businesses or even just our own personal relationships, it takes more than just force or cunning.
You have to build trust. Find some common ground and create systems that work for everyone, not just the people at the top.
That's a really great point.
I think that's one of the key takeaways from our dive into the Mongol Empire. You can be this brilliant strategist, a ruthless warrior, but if you don't know how to govern effectively, your power is not going to last.
It's like that old saying, like, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You can conquer territory, but you can't force people to accept your rule.
Exactly. And in the long run, that lack of genuine buy-in, that can be fatal.
But let's not forget that the Mongols' legacy isn't entirely negative.
Oh, absolutely not.
I mean, they did facilitate this incredible cultural exchange and interconnection across Eurasia.
Absolutely.
Their trade networks, they help spread ideas, technologies, artistic styles.
It's true.
So even in their decline, they left a lasting impact.
Yeah, they were destroyers and builders, unifiers and dividers, all wrapped up in one.
And I think that's what makes them so endlessly fascinating.
I agree. They challenge us to think critically about the nature of power, the complexities of cultural exchange, and the long-term consequences of conquest.
Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of Mongol strategies and power moves.
It's been a journey.
It has. I think we've given you, our listener, a lot to think about.
Hopefully.
You know, like a crash course in Mongol history, but also some timeless insights about leadership and just the nature of power itself.
Hopefully we've sparked a curiosity to explore further.
Because we've really only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a whole world of Mongol history out there waiting to be discovered.
Keep learning.
So keep learning.
Keep questioning.
Yeah, keep questioning.
And keep diving deep.
Until next time.